if you're at odds with each other, you're supposed to sit next to each other. You're not supposed to be looking across the table.
Yeah, that's the nicest he's ever been.
Go back to poorer societies.
There she is.
So connected to their resources, they understand. They have those connections.
No, but you know, it's interesting. There's a guy, have you ever met Ron?
I think it is not
From the
uniquely
University of Oregon.
Oregon. What do you think?
Does
Jim
political
Harper?
science.
We were talking about.
I have not. You know, there's so little contact between OSU and
You should,
U of M.
he does this cool stuff looking at.
We're going to start.
The ag subsidy negotiation.
First of all, I want to, we have all 9 of our speakers here collected. I want to thank them once again for what I think has been a very invigorating day. And thank them for hanging with us for this one more roundtable. You note that Ingrid seems to have put Andy and Josh at other ends of the table. I'm sure that's completely accidental. I'm going to try and do something here that I've never tried before, but as I said right before lunch, in these conferences and in attending conferences like this, there's always this great conversation, and people start trending towards some ideas and how to proceed, and then we conclude the conference and we all go back to our homes and forget 4 weeks from now what quite was that thought that we were having in that conference. So what I've tried to do here, and what I'm actually trying to do, is present a PowerPoint I've developed over the course of the day, teasing out some of the principles, of design principles for oceans policy reform that we may have heard about today. This is going to be over your head, so what I think I'll do is I'll read you questions and the like when I see them, and I'll try and make sure everybody's on the same page. So I couldn't resist putting this slide up there first, and thank you for David for letting me steal this little cartoon. My name is Tim Profeta. For those of you who weren't here in the morning, I'm the director of the Nicholas Institute of Environmental Policy Solutions, and we're a newly created institute trying to fulfill David's mission here. There's always been a kind of a disconnect between our academic understanding and our people in decision-making capacities, policymakers alike. And the Nicholas Institute is intended to be that red arrow on the bottom graph to better communicate our understanding and help us find ways forward on the environment. So the purpose of this session is really because there's a moment of need in our view right now. There is an imminent oceans debate coming in Congress, in my view and in our view. We may have some skepticism about this Congress, but the 2 commission reports, which are quite politically salient right now, coupled with some of the, what I would call idiosyncratic aspects of Congress, you have some senior members who are looking to act on oceans policy, in part because it's going to be their legacy in their retirement, have made 2006 a year where there is going to be an oceans policy conversation. And, or as Josh said in the morning, this is a moment, and it's a moment in time that may pass. If the next Congress gets elected and they have a different set of priorities, it may be 2007 before we can re-engage this debate, and by that time the shelf life of the Commission's report in Washington is probably expired. But I'm also going to pull from what Laura said this morning. There are many members of Congress right now who are uncomfortable legislating on this, and particularly with today's topic, legislating ecosystem-based management. And I think Laura and I are quoting the same staffer from Congress when there's one staffer who's key to this debate who keeps saying, I don't know what this is. And until somebody tells me what this is, I can't advise anybody to legislate and put that mandate out to the executive branch. Now, we have tried today, many of our panelists have tried to sort of tease out what that is. And now what I'm going to try and do with these slides and the questions they'll pose is tease out even more a consensus view on what are some of the design principles behind ecosystem-based management. And after today, I should note, tomorrow morning, Ingrid and I are going to try and come up with some sort of document reflecting what we hope to hear today in this roundtable, and we'll spend a little time tomorrow trying to draft it into a usable form so we actually have written down all those ideas we thought were coming together in this conference that we would have forgotten 4 weeks from now if we had not written them down. So I have grouped the questions that I've come up through the course of the day into 3 areas. We have some overarching questions. We have some questions of institutional reform. We have questions about what is our capabilities to actually do ecosystem-based management. And we have some questions about the regional programs and the lessons we can learn and scale up or translate into a more overarching policy. So now I will do is, the way I like to proceed is I'm going to pose these questions. I'm going to try and get some reaction from the panelists, and then we'll also bring in questions from the audience, and we'll try and proceed sort of a pace through these 4 areas. First overarching question that I wanted to ask is, do we really need a large institutional reform, as many of our panelists have suggested? The Bush administration has contended that they are already doing ecosystem-based management. You do already have a regional system in place through the fishery management councils. The first question, panelists, is what is it about institutionally that we must change in the structure, and do we need to do it?
You want to go down the
Yeah.
line? Or,
Yeah.
well, I don't know how you want to parcel things out, but I won't be mean to Josh anymore, at least. It's Laura's turn. There's 2 things about whether you need a large institutional change. The first one is that I do believe you need some kind of an overarching mandate that says, yes, institutions go away and knit together the pieces. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, well, yeah, people will do things because they think it would be a good thing to do, but it's going to be, a tertiary task or way down the list because they have to meet their primary mandates. And that's why you need a National Ocean Policy Act, which actually tells institutions to change direction from what they're doing now. It's fine to say, well, we could do all of these things with our existing structure, but you're not going to do all of those things in a day-to-day agency environment at the state or at the federal level unless you're given a new mandate to do so. The second part of this is that institutions tend not to change direction easily. Large institutions, and government institutions are always large, tend not to change direction easily. So the idea that the existing institutions sitting in the same structure with the same name on the door, with the same bosses, are all of a sudden going to do something totally different, I just don't think works very well with human nature. NOAA was created by by sticking into a single agency under executive order 5 disparate agencies: the Weather Service, the Ocean Service, the Fisheries Service, and so on. And one of the problems identified in terms of the interaction between, or one of the problems for NOAA, is trying to get those line offices to work together. Well, they were never created as NOAA, other than now you're under this umbrella organization. And so they continued to do their missions the way that they always had, and their mandates changed over time, but they never felt any obligation to work differently across the lines. And the same thing is true for other agencies and other governmental entities. So,
Laura, do you want to add to that?
I do want to add to that, and I don't have a little microphone on. Can you hear me?
you have that one.
I'm a little bit scared to talk because I'm sitting next to Andy, and I'm scared he's going to be mean to me. So I'm going to agree with everything that he said. So what he said, and what I would add to that is the analogy that someone made earlier today about going out to Home Depot and buying some wood and nails and going home and building a house without any sort of plan. And if you heard my remarks at the beginning of the day, I had the 30-second slide on the history of the development of ocean and coastal policy in this country, and that's exactly what it was. It was building a structure without a plan. So there were good, valid, and valuable pieces of legislation that were needed to address management of these important resources, but they were done on an individual basis, and there's never been an opportunity to see how they relate to each other, how they are not relating to each other, and perhaps how they should. So this does seem like that moment in time that just suggests that we have to take a look. If we don't have it now, then we're probably not going to have it again for the next 35 years when our leaders decide that it's time to take another look at how we manage these resources.
Susan?
I would like to add to that at the time these special agencies were developed piece by piece, we had the luxury of doing that a little more because we weren't in such conditions of intensive use and spillover effects and scarcity. We don't live in that world anymore, and we don't have the luxury of doing things piecemeal if we want the whole to function in an effective way. And what we have are the path-dependent outcomes of following these individual paths over time at a time when we had much more surplus of resources and we had the luxury of fooling around a little bit more, just taking a narrower look. And I think conditions are just fundamentally different now in terms of our demands on ocean resources, that we don't have that luxury anymore. I would support this, the need for this integrated, comprehensive act.
Yeah, I would just add to that, plus our understanding of the connectedness in a better, perhaps, way than we had before, when we had that luxury.
Marc, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think the base condition for any answer to this question has to do with the phrase that I think Laura had in her presentation this morning, and that is political will. Anything we're talking about here, whether it's agency by agency, mandate by mandate, big, broad congressional action, whatever it is going to have to come from people through political will. That's the only way any of this is going to get changed. Now, that puts us in a funny box. And the box is that, in fact, if there's a window that's no more than 2 or 3 years in the shelf life, as you said, of these reports, I don't think we're going to generate that political will in 2 or 3 years. I was really struck, the reason I can go to bed at night happy is I watched Jon Stewart. And he had a happy conservative, I forget his name, little chubby bald guy, who had written this book about why the conservative movement was successful now. And what he was pointing out is that they watched the Johnson administration in the 60s, and they started a plan. And they've been working on it since the 60s. And now they're winning. And I think we need, maybe not that longer-term strategy, but we need a decadal strategy on this, because political will is going to be the answer to any of this. Not technical advice, not input from NRDC or TOC or a university person. Political will is going to have to generate this. And the question is, how do we do that?
Well, it seems to me like the Katrina nightmare and some things that are happening right now, while we have to be sensitive in using them this way, I think that maybe there's an opportunity to point out a little bit more vigorously than I've seen pointed out the mistakes that have been made in the past that have made the consequences of these disasters so much greater than they needed to be. I mean, I know that on page 267 of the COP report, it has a box on New Orleans, and it said exactly what was going to happen, and it happened. And so we should really be pointing that out to everybody.
Some of that is the scenario analyses that I was talking about before. I mean, you need to look at that in terms of what would have happened if you hadn't taken certain actions, but it's useful painting, a beautiful simulation to do, which I can't believe, but somebody is doing now, is put the wetlands in place in the Gulf of Mexico and run the Katrina storm energy at New Orleans and see what the storm surge is. Now, I know that, there's enough physics that you could actually do that analysis. I'm sure the models exist to do it. But if you actually had that playing over and over again on, even the Discovery Channel, it would have a big impact, because it makes real what the difference is. You can't just say, well, we told you this was going to happen. You actually have to show, so if we had done something else, this is what would have happened instead. And that's a fairly important picture to draw, to generate political will.
Larry?
I want to comment a little bit on Mike's comment on political will. I agree that to move ahead with any kind of large institutional reform, we would have to get the political will gathered together. But it seems like it's also a disservice to acquiesce to something less than would be necessary because it's politically feasible. There's a real trade-off here, because you say, well, okay, well, what you're proposing is politically feasible, let's go ahead. It's not going to do the job, but let's go ahead, because at some point in the future, people come back and say, well, but you told us that would do the job. So I think there is pressure to try to make it clear what would be needed.
Let me on the first question, I haven't heard any dissent from anybody that we do need institutional reform. We cannot do it on the current existence. Josh, do you want to dissent on that? Or?
I think there are a lot of variations when you talk about what do you mean by large institutional reform. I'm not opposed to a national ocean policy. I think that's a good idea to think about what we want the oceans to look like in
Right.
100 years. But I'm not convinced that we need, I think recommending the creation of a new agency, for example, I think that's a bad idea. That's a non-starter. You know, my biggest thing is that I think with the current Congress and the current leadership in the Senate, that my biggest concern, which is fishery management councils manage 100% of the EEZ, I don't think we'll ever see the kind of conservation that we would need to see or want to see as long as that fact remains true, and that will not change under the current leadership in the Senate, I don't think. Right?
You know what occurs actually, that just say I'm not that far out of Washington DC. If you create a new agency, you'd send it through the Government Affairs Committee, which would be Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman, and not through Ted Stevens.
Right.
So, yeah, maybe there's a political reason to go that way.
You won't get rid of the fishery management councils under any congressional leadership, I would say.
No.
I don't think it depends on the current leadership. And actually, there is no recommendation to create a new agency in the,
Right.
actually in either commission report. There is a recommendation in the Pew report to move NOAA to a different place, not in the
Well, let me go to the second bullet here, which is going to go back to where Mike and Larry were discussing, and I know Mike wanted to talk again about it, is if we do need this institutional reform, there's the creep approach where you take what you can get this year, get something forward, what I would call evolution of the form, or there is you wait until the moment in time when you have created the adequate political will for the revolutionary change and do that. And so the question is, do we have to wait to do it in one fell revolutionary swoop, or do we do it in an evolutionary way?
Well, I don't think that's an either or.
Okay.
I think if you look at the kind of history that Laura related this morning, what you can see is the things that allowed revolutionary change to happen when they happened. The confluence of the environmental movement and the civil rights movement in the 60s. So you can see that happening. And you can ask yourself, is that happening now? Or let's watch for things that might create conditions like that, where you can really get the iceberg rotating 90 degrees all at once. But that doesn't mean you have to not do anything, or say it's too politically hard to do the whole thing now. What you do is you develop a strategy. You say, here is where we want to get a decade from now, and here are the things that we can start doing now in this way, and this way, and this way, and then we're going to build and add on over time and have a strategy. And that's not doing nothing because it's too politically hard. It's doing what you can do and having a plan.
Which builds support for the revolutionary moment, because incrementally, you've got some steps along the way that are signaling success and some progress.
Yeah, I think what Laura said this morning about getting something done now is very important, because although all of this is so important to all of us in this room, I mean, we're barely a blip on the radar screen when it comes to Washington or most of the citizens of the United States. Even they don't know, they don't care, that kind of thing. But without some starting point, no matter how incremental it is, I think it's very important that some start is made.
Even in a state like you that's completely surrounded by water.
Amber?
Yeah, I agree. We definitely should try to make some progress where we can, but I also agree with you, Mike, that it's really issue dependent. And when you think about California and the Marine Life Protection Act and the marine protected areas that are being proposed, if we just take incremental steps and we don't do it right, we just put in a couple that are too small or not well regulated, or we put them in and then they're not monitored or evaluated, then we're going to fail. And I think it sets up potentially a bad cascading effect where then people think that they don't work, or they're not working for the way that we want them to work. And so I think that we do have to think really carefully about how we incrementally implement some of the issues that we're talking about.
I'm actually going to move these slides forward since we have a few of them. I'm stealing from Andy's presentation here. I thought he offered a pretty useful, very brief definition of ecosystem-based management, which is something that considers the entire ecosystem, including humans, has an integrated approach that focuses on cumulative impacts and has a goal of maintaining and restoring the ecosystem to its health. And I thought I'd put it back up there and say, as a fundamental premise, is this a good definition? Do all the panelists agree that this could be a basic definition for what we are talking about?
I'm sitting next to him, I definitely agree. That's not why I agree, I actually do.
I'm not trying to foment conflict. I'm trying to get a sort of a semantical definition that we can all use for it.
I think it's a good conceptual definition, and I think, but it's not an operational definition, but that's not how it was presented. But
Right.
as a conceptual definition and frame, it
Okay.
seems perfectly comprehensive and reasonable to me.
Yeah, I agree, but I still think you'd have people say, well, what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm. No, I understand. Mike?
I think it's got the right parts, but it's not quite there. I have now come to the position that all environmental policy is social policy. It is policy about human values and desired human states of the environment and their interaction with it. And so, in fact, we need to not have ecosystem in some biophysical sense being the lead phrase. We need to have human behavior the lead phrase. Ecosystem management is the management of human behaviors that affect a certain biophysical environment that we define. That's my definition of ecosystem management. It kind of turns the first sentence around. It doesn't say, yeah, include humans. It says humans are the issue. Manage human behaviors that affect some environment, physical environment, biophysical environment that you define.
Mike, would you get any different outcome, though? I mean, obviously, we're talking about managing human behavior, but to maintain or restore an ecosystem, how are you going to do that except managing human behavior? And it's, I'm just, is there a conceptual difference in terms of the effective difference in terms of what happens with a definition?
Well, there is to me for two reasons. First, if you just have the term managing an ecosystem out there, there's some lack of clarity in what you're actually talking about doing. That's the first thing. The second thing is we've allowed ourselves to believe that if we just know enough biology, we'll know the answer to what to do, which has always been nonsense. And we got to say it's nonsense. We got to say it's managing human behavior based on human values. That's what we're talking about here. Now, a lot of people don't like that because they think we take a warm and cuddly hit by doing that. Okay, and we can't. It's not people's minds of fur seals and beautiful waterfalls. We're going to have to think about the same kind of things that you think about in a town meeting talking about local zoning. Yuck. Well, I'm sorry, that's what it is. So I'm out to eliminate confusion.
Andy?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's ever confused me with being warm and cuddly. In recent memory, I think it is quite true that you're managing human behavior, and perhaps you can come up with a better phrase than ecosystem-based management, but it fundamentally is not ecosystem management. It's ecosystem-based because you're managing the humans. You're not managing the ecosystem. You're not engineering the ecosystem. And I actually don't think that the argument is, well, if we just knew enough, then we'd know exactly what to do. I think the whole point of the concept, and in fact of the consensus statement in full, not the bullet points, it is that there are lots of things that you know are important to do now, even with very imperfect knowledge, because your knowledge will always be imperfect. It's not a matter of, well, let's just get all the understanding we can about how the ecosystem works, and then we'll know exactly what to do. You could take that approach to climate change too, but by the time you knew all that stuff, we all will have boiled. So it's not, it's not a terribly useful approach. So it is ecosystem based. Now I think you could come up with a better way to say that perhaps, but it is fundamentally not ecosystem management. And it is important to keep in there that the goal is maintaining a set of ecosystem services that support human well-being, the language of the Millennium Assessment. And so I don't think those points should be lost.
Larry?
Yeah, I was going to reiterate that this is still a human-oriented goal. If you look at the goal, it's to protect ecosystems to provide the services humans want and need. And point one, if I recall, was simply trying to make it clear that humans are part of ecosystems. They impact ecosystems, but they depend on the structure and function of ecosystems as well. So none of this, as I read it, had in the consensus statement had anything to say negative or positive about the fact that you're managing humans. That's clear in the consensus statement that it's not about managing ecosystems, it's about managing human behavior. But there are still some people who think somehow humans are separate from ecosystems, or they're just the bad guys that have some negative impacts on the biophysical ecosystem. And I think the reason for this statement was, humans depend on these systems to function for commerce, for health, for a whole bunch of things.
I think one really interesting thing about that that's not in here is that it assumes that all humans want the same services. And I think it says the services that humans want. And my view would be, what do we do if humans don't agree on what they want? Okay, that's really what I'm interested in.
Which will inevitably be the case, yeah.
Which will inevitably be the case. And so do we just compromise and have the Steve Roady rule, the 51% chance of success? Sorry. Or, yes. Or 18% is better, right? Do we just have a 51% chance of success, or do we go ahead and say, actually what we're going to do is we're going to try to satisfy different people in different ways? I mean, consensus isn't always, uniformity and consensus isn't really my idea of a dream world.
If you did Andy's sort of zoning proposal, and you had areas where you were providing the ecosystem services, the conservation services you want, you had areas where you're providing the fishing services, other constituencies want, you could be creating something that satisfies all humans. Correct. In the overall schematic, but not in any particular area. Might the key be the word management, which is now an acronym, thanks to me, but management is the key term for you, Mike, because you're managing human behavior. It's what you're doing. So it's ecosystem-based management of human behavior.
DOHB.
We'll take that back to Washington. Yes, thank you.
Tim, do you think that definition would help the staffer that you're referring to? I mean, I think that's...
No, I think I have to get to the next slides to help the staffer I'm referring to. So.
Tell the staffer you should quote the famous rock and roll line. You can't always get what you want. When you try real hard, sometimes you get what you need. So that's what we're trying to do, is get what we need here, right? Get what you want.
It's now my 4-year-old daughter's favorite song. She sings it in the back seat. It's a good lesson for raising kids. I'm going to institutional reforms. First, the division between the two that we heard about between the two commission reports on the voluntary council. If we have only voluntary councils, how do we not fall victim to Susan's failure to make credible commitments when you need actual legal authority to create those commitments, and all you have saying behind you is a consensus agreement amongst the stakeholders? I mean, that'd be great if you have win-win situations where all the stakeholders agree, but you're not going to always have win-win situations. You have win-loss situations, and then how does a consensus-based organization just not fall apart at that point in time? David?
Yeah, I would observe that we can't try and bundle all of our needs into regional ocean governance. That there are multiple strategies that we're going to pursue to respond to the issues that we've been talking about. For example, we should be looking at some federal statutes that apply throughout the United States in the same way and build in some flexibility to better respond to regional issues in a particular region. Now, the danger of that is there might be some watering down of those federal standards, but the upside is that there's greater flexibility to better respond to the issues in that particular area. And so my observation is, we need more flexibility in the system based on some standards.
Like a Clean Air Act model.
Do you want to, do you have a Clean Air Act model where you have, or do you have, I think it was Andy did, national goals, regional standards, or forgive me if I get this wrong, regional standards and local tactics for implementation?
Well, it's regional strategy to address national goals.
Yeah.
I mean, and there are other models of that, Clean Air Act and things like that. The problem here is that actually the language is wrong. It's not a hard legal authority. It's, do you want to mandate the councils? Do you want to require that there be councils? There is authority. There is hard legal authority. It's called, the Clean Water Act and the Magnuson Act and, the Coastal Zone Management Act and so on. And those authorities can be modified to actually support the work of regional councils. the question is, do you want to require that every region have a council and that a council then be the focus of regulatory action? That was the question that the commissions were wrestling with and came out somewhat differently on that point. So I'm not sure I agree with the way that it's.
Well, but if the regional council, absent amendments to the Clean Water Act, the regional council has no authority to implement the Clean Water Act or to enforce a permit or the like.
Right. Absolutely, they don't. But you can still enforce it because agencies can be required to comply with a regional plan.
Okay, so you'd have to require, you'd have to put something in that allowed some force behind the regional plan.
Right, but do you want to require that every region have a council, which would be a requirement? And if the answer is no, then how do you make sure that there aren't some regions that you just go down the tube? There's a question back there.
Sure.
I just want to know where consensus comes in. I didn't notice anyone particularly speaking about the goal is to reach a consensus. The goal is to manage in an ecosystem, within an ecosystem-based approach, but while trying to meet people's needs and wants and desires, but I never saw consensus as the ultimate goal.
I think I introduced the term, so I think I have to explain it. The reason that the term is there is because if you're not required to come up with a regional council, as I was viewing it, then you'd have to find agreement amongst the participants in the region as to how to proceed on a regional basis. And that would necessitate they have consensus amongst them on what that plan is. Like David was saying about the New England governors, they create consensus-based agreements with each other, with the Eastern Canadian premiers, and if they do such, it's only as good as the governor who made the agreement.
So it's consensus to create the council, not consensus in the council's decision.
It's not among stakeholders, though.
Well, it can be, though.
It can
You
be.
know, we actually have two really good models of how to do this. One is the Coastal Zone Management Act, which didn't require any states to do anything, but they all did.
Not much.
And the other, well,
They did something, but not much.
But I would argue, under the standard of are we better off than had they done nothing, that we in fact are.
Yeah.
Even though I had the dinner, I think I was telling Amber, I had a dinner with Peter Douglas a year or two ago, who's the executive director of the California Coastal Commission. He was depressed. He said, there's just too much money, too many people. We've done good things, but we're losing. Well, fine, but we'd be losing worse without the California Coastal Commission. I think the other example is the National Estuary Program. Nobody was required to have a National Estuary Program. It was a carrot sort of program. And by my somewhat naive read of the outcome of those things, they did a lot of good stuff in getting people to talk to each other. And they were essentially consensus operations among wildly different groups of people. Maybe all we need to do is suggest, the only problem with the National Estuary Programs as ecosystem management is that they generally didn't go into the ocean at all. Okay? So maybe all we need to do is a new generation of NEP carrot type programs that says you got to go to the EEZ boundary.
I just want to echo that. I think that's a good model, and I think I was having a discussion with someone during the break about the CZMA as a potential model. I mean, you can see the analogies, and under the U.S. Commission's framework that it set up, and some of the things that Andy's been saying today about you had a National Ocean Policy Act that set up a structure that created a council at the national level that would provide some guidance and some standards and some incentives for creating these regional structures that wouldn't mandate their creation, but would incentivize the regions to work together and to be able to work within the system and gain advantage of those incentives. They would have to live up to some certain standards that are in the Policy Act. So there are some analogies. It's still voluntary, but if you decide you want to play, there are certain rules that you have to abide by.
And you have to give them resources. Yeah, there has to be a carrot.
Yeah, and I would also say, just in response to, I think, some of Donna's remarks, that also in the Commission's report, and Andy, chime in with me on this if you want to, I would argue that there actually are some incentives for the regions to want to create these, come together in these voluntary systems under a structure similar to what I just described. It's not just regional, it has to be seen in the context of the entire National Ocean Policy Framework that the Commission recommended. And that incentives, sure, we could argue about whether financial and technical support is enough of an incentive to bring together, but that is something. And also the notion of these regional ecosystem assessments is huge because it enables those agencies and at the state level to have access to information that they struggle with right now and have to recreate every time they want to do something.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that I don't think that all four have to be consensus for, or all four have to be regulatory voting or mandated. I think some programs are going to work very effectively through a consensus mechanism, and some programs are going to work better because there's actually a hard standard that people are in some sense required to meet, whether that's for the gain of resources or it's so that they don't get sued by the meanies. So I don't think that we should imagine that it's one model or the other. You're going to have some mixture of those. In an ocean council, I don't think I just imagine that you would end up in a bureaucratic morass at a regional level if you created a bureaucratic structure that was sort of ticking off whether people had done their jobs. You're just creating another layer, and we were trying very hard to avoid creating another bureaucratic layer without first making sure that the authorities were fixed so that you could achieve the goal.
I have one follow-up question, then Donna. Christie's has been waiting patiently. And forgive me if I'm the one who's caught up on this, but the standards that need to be implemented, are there new standards that need to be incorporated in the new Ocean Policy Act that we're creating, or do you think there's adequate standards out there right now to be implemented?
In my opinion, there are new standards that are needed.
Okay. Donna?
I just wanted to go back to what Laura was saying about the voluntary idea, and if everybody wants to play. It seems like the dynamic, a lot of these things are such that everybody doesn't necessarily have to agree they want to play, but once a certain critical number have decided they're going to play, everybody else is going to come in to protect their interests. The stakeholders are going to be there, the other states are going to be there, so it's a lot about finding that critical mass to get it started.
Mm-hmm. David and Josh?
Yeah, this question just reminds us of our discussions over the last 4 or 5 hours that form follows function. You're going to have councils to do something. Amber had some nice slides this morning about let's be sure it's not a problem in search of a solution. And that some regions are self-organizing, have a culture to do that kind of thing, and they may be able to accomplish a number of things without a council. I'm just thinking, a lot of the regions are thinking about regional associations around ocean observing. And they're thinking about pushing that a little bit further beyond just observing to begin to think about coordinated monitoring and data management and some other things, which would take some of the issues that the Ocean Commission talked about off the table because they'd be occurring in a different forum.
I just had a question about, it's really just I don't know how this is going to work kind of question. Is it going to be kind of like the Atlantic Coastal Act where say 7 out of 8 states in a region want to participate, but the other state doesn't? What happens to that other state? Do they just get to do whatever they want? Do we have a free rider problem? Or are they forced, like the Atlantic Coastal Act, if they don't do it, then they get a moratorium on all their ocean activities?
Well, Atlantic Coastal Act doesn't quite do it that way, but what it does say is that even if you decide not to play in the consensus forum, you have to abide by the result.
Right. Okay.
And that's what Atlantic Coastal Cooperative Fisheries Management Act. So in fact, North Carolina, in the early days of ACFACMA, decided that it wasn't going to participate in the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission discussions on a certain issue until they find out that they were going to have to abide by the result anyway. In which case, the value of saying, well, we're not going to play is
so is that what you have in mind
immediately
for these
diminished. That would be my preference. The recommendation, I think, is vaguer than that.
Okay. I mean, because I think that's very important. Because as we know, one kind of free riding state can ruin things, the political dynamic especially.
think it goes, we said in some other forms too, there needs to be a default assumption that incentivizes participation and, rather than the reverse.
Yeah, but that,
Sure.
just kind of speaking, that's a very, very different model from the NEP model. The NEP model is simply says you have an incentive to plan and cooperate with each other. Basically, the authorities are all there. The Atlantic Coastal Act created new authority. So they're very, very different.
I have a question in the back of the room there.
Yeah, suppose we did something like the Coastal Zone Management Act and created a national framework that the regions could buy into. How do you reconcile that with Amber's idea of letting the resource define the region?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Letting the resource define the regions, did you say that?
She talked about letting
The issue define the region.
Be defined by the regions, you mean?
No,
No.
basing your, like if you're talking about highly migratory species, your region is going to be very different than if
Oh,
you're
I see.
talking about groundfish. So how would you work that into a national framework that, or standard that the regional plans would have to meet?
This goes to the issue that the council has to, if it's sediment management, now we're talking about this part of the coast. It's migratory waterfowl, now we're talking about this part of the coast. It totally depends on the issue that we're responding to. So that's why this kind of, it got me a little nervous of, voluntary council sounding as though it's just going to be plunked down and it's going to be dealing with all of these issues.
But
it's just a tool to accomplish something. We have to figure out what that something is.
yeah, I think that's true if you mandate councils. This is how every region will have a council, and here's how we've defined the regions and so on. I think it is possible to define regions in which many of the scales will be encompassed, and I think the large marine ecosystem concept works for that. That doesn't mean that all issues will be encompassed within that. Migratory birds, migratory fish and marine mammals and sea turtles and so on are going to cross regional boundaries, and there always have to be mechanisms for interaction between the regions. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't set up a set of standards that includes the importance of doing that collaboration across regions for those resources that cross regions. Yeah. So, yeah, you have to fudge it a little bit, but you try to find a workable scale for many of the proximate issues, and then deal with those that don't fit within that scale by an additional provision.
I mean, I think one of our speakers said, there is no scale that works for everything, but certainly the ecologically based one will be better than the politically based ones.
Right, but if you do that, how do you pick that scale? Are you going to pick a scale that's going to be large enough to deal with most of the issues that you're concerned with, or are you going to pick a scale that's going to be workable with the groups that are involved? So at some point you get to where, well, yeah, we want to do the California current large marine ecosystem, but we just can't politically pull that off. So where do you find the balance between something that's workable politically and something that's workable for an ecosystem sense?
Just because you choose a scale for,
You live in California, yeah,
for a
that's
set
right.
of discussions doesn't mean that you don't have subgroups within that. I just don't think you could focus too much on trying to get the scale right and never get it right, and I think you're quite correct. Or you could choose a workable scale for a number of issues and then say, but we know for certain things we're going to have a much smaller scale, and we create the subgroups to deal with those issues. And that part of that is the reason for creating voluntary councils that are designed to specifically focus on a set of issues that are proximate in a region. If you create essentially a Washington mandate that says, here's how your regional councils will be constructed and here's what they will do, you lose all of that flexibility, potentially, because people don't then feel like they've made the decision about how they're going to address those problems. They feel like it's been imposed. And, to some extent, the regional fishery management councils have had exactly that problem, which is why they, essentially the councils said, okay, we accept the authority, and now we're going to challenge what you've told us to do. And they played that game for the first 15 years, 20 years of the councils. That, yes, you've given us the authority, but we don't agree with your working premise, which is that we have to protect against overfishing in some areas. And that's because it was a mandated structure that they were required to work within. So you've got to allow some flexibility so that they think it was their idea, even though it wasn't. It's one of those kind of things.
I'm gonna move on to the next slide. That's all right.
And I'm going to leave, so thank
Yes.
you all very much.
Yeah, we're now losing both Laura and Andy, so
she
let's
has to go
thank them before we move on to the next slide.
Thank you. Thank you. I never did provide a proper thank you to the organizers at Marc and Ingrid and your colleagues who did a great job. Panelists, it was a pleasure to work with you today, and thanks for everything. Bye.
I'm going to go on to the next point, which is pulling out from Susan Hanna's presentation that a key design question is to build institutions to minimize transaction costs. And I think the softball question here is, does everybody agree with that? But the harder question is, what does that mean when it comes to designing a federal system and regional systems? What do we need to do to make sure that we don't, particularly with our political system, layer it back in with incentives? What are the things to be averse to doing? And I'll let Susan start.
I agree. I think she's right. This ties into what we were just talking about, and that is mandating versus voluntary regional councils. And I think this relates because it's a different thing to mandate a structure than to say, here are national standards, and here are some resources, and how you meet those standards, how you organize to meet those standards is a matter of regional flexibility. And we've seen this work pretty effectively in the Northwest, or in the example of watershed councils, for example. There was a forcing mechanism. There were recovery requirements under ESA. So watersheds in the state of Oregon were faced with a choice of, here are some resources, here are the standards, here are the mandates about recovery and habitat improvement. You can figure it out, or someone else will figure it out for you. That's kind of a negative, incentive. But the positive incentive was, here are some resources, here are the standards, and people organized around that in ways that made sense for the political, economic climate of that area. And I've seen that work effectively, and that's why I think regional flexibility is a good thing, coupled with measurable standards and resources to provide an incentive to do it.
I think I'm hearing a theme coming through, and we've got a series of good examples of if you have to have a default that causes people to want to act. Right.
Yeah, it gets your attention.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
And so with the salmon, we had the ESA. We may not have that comparably for some of our fisheries. So that may be Andy's. Now I can start speaking for him. Andy's standards he thinks we need to impose in the National Act.
I think you need standards. You need some kind of one useful thing about an external threat is that it unifies the group internally and minimizes the incentive to do the internal kind of fighting and struggling. It's very useful to have an external threat. I call it a threat. That's kind of extreme, but that's what a standard could be. That's certainly what the ESA is.
Steve?
Since Andy's gone, I'll speak for Andy. He wrote that chapter, or a lot of it, in the U.S. Commission report, and his threat in the fisheries management was, you're going forward, you try to set an allowable biological catch for the next year, you know you've been overfishing. If you don't set it, guess what? You just stop fishing. Right. How about that for a credible threat? It's not business as usual. It's not status quo. It's you stop fishing. So you set that new ABC. Now there's a threat. Now that of course would turn the entire fisheries management on its head right now. It would institutionalize precautionary management, which we don't have now. But there's a credible threat for you.
I think you also call it the second quickest to fail recommendation of the, yeah. But what is as a sort of less draconian alternative is the FIP process from the Clean Air Act. We've talked about Clean Air Act. I mean, what if the federal government would, in the Clean Air Act, if you don't have a state implementation plan to meet your national standards, the federal government will come in and do it for you. That's only happened, I think, once in history. But that it doesn't create a zero. It creates a removal of decision-making authority from your region, state, et cetera. Is there any problem with that model as a backstop?
Well, it's interesting because that's not the, I'm thinking about Mike kind of going back to the CZMA and the NEPs.
Right.
That's not the model they use. And I wonder if, I don't recall anything in the legislative history of the CZMA about the national government coming in and doing anything if the states failed to go in and zone their own, or not zone their own coast, but put into place some type of coastal program. I think what might have been different was that when the CZMA was passed, there was this idea that there was going to be some type of national land use policy on the heels of that, and that really never came. But it is interesting to look at the CZMA if we think about federal funding plus a consistency measure, some type of consistency measure. That's one model versus this, the federal government comes in. If you don't do it, if you don't do it right or if you don't do it at all, the federal government comes in.
Let me say, is there a difference, a temporal difference here? I'd love to know, when were all the CZMA plans done? Were they done within the next the 5 years following?
Oh, no.
They've been updated. 80% of them.
Well, I would say the vast majority, the act was in 72, the vast majority, because there was Section 305 first, for 3 or 4 years, the vast majority actually came in between 78 and 82 or 3. And now we've got, outliers like Indiana, Illinois coming in.
Georgia, Texas.
Josh?
It's an interesting question, though, because the consistency requirement is something that I don't see the analog here. You could say, money was a key factor for the states to get, that was the carrot, but the consistency requirement was almost a bigger carrot, right?
Yeah.
If you come in and do this, we'll give you control over what happens in an area that's not even under your jurisdiction, to some control. So I don't see the equivalent, maybe I'm missing it, in the regional council. What's the equivalent carrot that's out there?
How do they get reverse preemption ability vis-a-vis NIMS if they do their stuff right? Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you may not have that kind of carrot.
But something else besides money, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
I'm just wondering if it's parallel tracks rather than one or the other.
That'd be
Is
the
it-
carrot and the stick.
Yeah, is it the flexibility within the region that a region gets to decide which of these flexible models it's going to use?
I think one of the things that when we talk about hard standards, probably the hardest part, the most difficult hard standard, but probably the most necessary in the end for ecosystem management is an ecosystem functioning standard. Larry has brought this up several times. He's done it in the sense of services. That may not be the way to do it, but is there an ecosystemic standard separate from the standards of the components? Water quality, fisheries, habitat, whatever it is. Is there a broad ecosystemic standard we can even imagine? I think that's a really incredible challenge. But if we could come up with that, that would be really, really important. It would be really hard to do. With respect to this transaction cost, I would actually expand Susan's statement to say that a key design question is to build institutions to make sure we realize what the transition costs are and what the long-term maintenance costs of a new system are with respect to the benefits to society that it would yield. That's the question. Is there transition costs, and there's also a question of the long-term viability of the system. Because we're in danger in these ecosystem things of creating incredibly cumbersome bureaucracies that, some people think our fisheries management bureaucracy is like that now. That it costs way more than it should be costing for the benefits society actually gets from it. So I would expand this a little bit to go not just transition costs, but the long-term cost benefit of the system we're setting up.
What are some examples of what to do wrong in terms of designing the system? If we design the system, maybe we can get some concrete examples of what not to do in terms of creating a system that has too much transactions costs here.
Certainly one thing would be if it were entirely funded by the federal government. Because you earn no ownership by the states. The states have to have the incentive like consistency to participate, but the states have to be contributing cash and people to make it go. Because the day the federal, so we run this out, if you don't take that approach, federal government is the primary funder, 2037, there aren't the funds, and suddenly we stop doing all of this. You have to be earning participation all along the way. So good stakeholder participation.
Is that a averted transaction? I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm not seeing if that's I think that's a good point. Is that a averted transaction cost, or is that a sort of institutional buy-in point?
Well, your question was what would be some qualities that you would want to see in this?
Or what would you not want to see?
Not want to see in terms of avoidance of transaction costs. Some examples of maybe in the current system where there's too much transaction costs. Susan?
I think one of the ways to load up transactions costs is to focus on prescribing process rather than focusing on performance outcomes. Because if you can define the performance outcomes that are desired, people will naturally try to minimize their costs in achieving those outcomes. That's just a natural dynamic that will happen. If you instead try to prescribe all the details of all the process that has to happen, and that's the way you can make something be very, very cumbersome.
It'd be fair to say that might go back to set clear standards or goals, and then sort of wait down to the tactical implementation level where it's attuned to the needs of the region. It's operating on the scale of the problem. So you set the goal at the national level, but don't prescribe too much process on how to get there. Would that be fair to say?
That would be one of my general takes on it.
Which is one of the lessons we learned through the Clean Air Act,
Right.
where we at one point were prescribing specific technologies companies had to use, as opposed to saying, we want to see these emissions coming out of your stack, figure out the best way to do it.
Josh?
I was just going to say, I mean, building on what you're getting at, I mean, I think you need, and this is something Susan said earlier, some clarity. I mean, the most maximum clarity about what it is that these councils are supposed to be doing in a list, even if it's a list of here are the 10 things that you have to do each year, and here's what happens if you don't do them. I mean, I think that's really important. That's missing completely from our current system, that basic level of accountability and clarity. And that, as soon as you get rid of that, you increase everything. You increase litigation, you increase delay, you increase wiggling around.
Mm-hmm.
Now, without being too prescriptive, right? You don't want, maybe it's standards only,
Right.
but I think clarity and responsibility are really important.
So Tim, don't we in fact have two things going on? We need to decide which things can be developed as standards or outcomes we want to see, and people are flexible as how you obtain them. But then there's the other kind of activity which has, in some people's minds, proved useful in the past, and that is a complete emphasis on process, or almost complete. The CZMA NEP program saying, we actually don't care what you come up with, but talk to each other and do something. So maybe we need to decide which is in which category and proceed with both of them in some way.
All right. I wish I actually had all my. I've done this so on the fly. I'm not sure where I am in what to skip and what not. But I'm going to put this one out there. I think we heard from almost every speaker that there are conflicting policies. Craig, I'm really sorry I'm doing this to you with every slide, but that there are conflicting policies that would hamper it, and this would be the negative side of a policy proposal as opposed to the positive side. What, from your experience with the current system, what are the specific policies that are particularly problematic that should be particularly targeted if you are going to design the system? What would be inefficiencies that should be tweaked, removed, et cetera, in the current system? Because I think this always was left unsaid that there's these problems, but I don't think anybody ever came up and said, well, there are some serious problems here that unless we remove this part of the current program, we will never be able to implement our vision here. David?
I believe that as a part of the Ocean Commission's work, they hired someone to ferret these things out.
Right.
So we should just get a copy of
You should
that
just go
analysis.
cut and paste out of there. Good.
You know, I don't think they actually did, Dave.
Well, when I spoke with Laura about it, she said they had someone doing some of this work. I don't know if it was commission staff or a contract.
Well, they haven't put together the policies and mandates, but I don't think they focused on this particular question. Maybe they did now.
In California right now, we're doing an inventory of all the laws that have anything to do with coastal and ocean management. And that was one of the actions in our recent action plan, but it's in process, so I can't say, but we will have a document that says, here's what we've got and here's how they relate to each other.
Yes, where I have to replay the Rosenberg recording here, I think. And I think the key issues here are that the current management infrastructure is set up in sectors to manage portions of the ecosystem without reference to what the others are doing. Often agencies have multiple responsibilities within the agency that are sometimes in conflict. A lot of the agencies have legislative mandates to deal with part of the ecosystem or a geographic scale that doesn't match the scale of how this ecosystem really works. There's a whole series of mismatches in the spatial scale and the temporal scale at which things can happen in management response that doesn't match the essential time and space dynamics of the ecosystem. And I see those as sort of, institutional constraints on taking the existing institutions and remolding them to do ecosystem-based management. And those need to be sort of addressed systematically in terms of how the institutions that we're currently going to build on, if we take this approach, have to reform to match better the time and space dynamics of the system you're trying to address.
Anybody disagree with that? I think that's pretty.
The other thing Andy raised was that, and this is a symptom of the individual sector problem, is the common mistake of missing cumulative effects, not taking into account those sorts of, the interaction, for example, of water quality and fisheries production. If water quality were in good shape, maybe you produce enough fish to support the existing number of fishermen, but given that water quality is compromised, there have to be fewer fishermen because the systems are compromised.
I think one generic answer would be any policy that allows people not to play nicely with others. And what I'm thinking of is the military exclusion, for example. Military exclusion to a lot of environmental policies and processes, or even the relatively low level of input to the OCS processes, for example.
Before we finish institutional reforms, I want to go back to, and I may have skipped this question, but I think this idea of creating sort of a national goal that would then, have some federal or regional system for implementation down the chain is clearly something that's come out. When Steve was moderating, we all accused him of using too many weasel words and not having enough, basis in the acts. I mean, we can easily create standards that are passable at the blue-green level that then don't mean anything. We don't want Congress sitting there with the map on the floor circling zoning regions. How would we characterize the degree of specificity we want? What do we want in terms of these goals from leadership, from the Congress, from the federal government, that will provide, and I'm just thinking about how do you, if you were going to say, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Inouye, the only way we're going to do this is if we get this degree of specificity from you, or it's going to be just as worthless as number one. What do we ask them for?
Or stated differently, if we were going to write the national standards, what would they say? Would they say never overfish ever? Period. National standard 1. Just don't do it. 2, if you do, always deduct the overages. 3, I'm not sure that's going to work. I got to tell you, those were great, but I'm not sure that's going to work.
So what do you need? What's the next layer?
Why don't those work?
I think people would come in and say, you can't, it's happening right now in New England. They say, well, you can't never overfish. We're overfishing right now. If we're going to shut the whole fishery down. You'd put every fisherman in New England out of business if you did this.
Sorry, the reason you can't do it, the reason they don't work is, say it just said, must end overfishing, that's it. Even then, the stock assessment models are going to come out with something that tells you, in order to get a 100% chance of not overfishing, you have to have zero fishing. So then it's just a question of what chance is okay with you. 10% chance, 20% chance, 30% chance, and this is where we get into the 50% rule. I mean, that's really, and so that's where the negotiations take place between the industry and the conservationists, is 20% to 80%. And we end up usually In the past, we end up with 80%, but now maybe we're ending up with 51% XST, so, or 49%. So that's really the problem, is that the underlying science is where the debate, the uncertainty in the underlying science is where the debate is going to occur, and you can't legislate that out, I don't think.
I mean, could you overtly say, you know, a certain degree? I mean, I've drafted laws,
Right.
none of which I think passed, but I've drafted laws. I did have some that passed, just not these, that actually said, took statistical concepts in and legislated them and said, you know, your alpha value has to be X. And I mean, could we actually put that, I mean, you can use those sorts of disciplines to describe something generically that can then be applied in the specific, and so but you create more of a standard than never do it. You create a standard that you have to have a certain degree of confidence it will happen, and here's the confidence. Would that, you know, is it unreasonable to ask that from our Congress?
You give it a shot? Can you give it a shot?
You know, yeah, I mean, this is a really, maybe it's a tangential issue, but it's really fascinating. If you talk to the stock assessment scientists, what they'll tell you is even that last range that comes out of the model is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the uncertainties in those models, so that the answer to your question is even if you gave them a percentage, there are things that you can change earlier on in your model that will make it so that you get the answer that you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of the public process. So that's where I think there's a problem in trying to write the rules on a standard like that, in terms of a balancing statute.
But you should always attempt to be as specific and clear and data-based as you can.
Correct.
And then you enter the sausage-making process where it's a trade-off. And what kind of trade-offs are you likely to have to make is the question, I think, ultimately that the congressional people ask, and then the answer comes out whatever the acceptable trade-off.
Well, if you do statistical concepts, usually their eyes glaze over and then they, sorry. Steve?
Maybe we should come at this a little bit different way and just say, what are some of the basic problems that we have with management now, say, of the fisheries? And one of them, of course, is we don't have a clue what's really going on the ocean. What do we have? 2% observer coverage, 1% observer coverage, and 5% of the fleets? I mean, just some ridiculous number. The truth is we don't have any idea. If we would mandate, how about this for something you mandate and direct? Every fishing boat about more than 6 inches long shall have VMS on it. Mandated. Then you know where everybody is, right? And every boat bigger than 12 inches long shall have 2 observers on it. And then you know what's going on. Then you start generating data, which you can then make some, you know, determinations about what's really happening on the oceans. Rather than worrying about alpha values and plus and minus 51%, you just start pouring money into monitoring and research.
Well, this is actually
come back in 2 years.
One of the things that Jim Connaughton, when I talked to him about this, was most excited about was the idea of the fish finders on these boats, which create data every day, but then it just dissipates in the ether because they don't record it. What if you mandated that all fishing boats shall have that data required? I mean, that data.
Some central bank, we have 32,000 people writing it all down and
Right. Well, you can do a lot of it virtually now, so I mean, why not?
Is there a way to translate this into a principle? I mean, for example, the burden of proof principle. I mean, historically, the principle I think we've operated in fisheries is you get to do what you want unless somebody can show it's bad. Is there a way to reverse that in a way that says, no, you can't do anything out there unless you can actually show us it's okay? And one of the things that goes along with that principle is you got to let us know where you are all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there an overarching principle that we could use with public trust resources?
Isn't that just one statement of the precautionary principle?
Sure.
I think it's NEPA.
Well, I think burden of proof is different from that. I think burden of proof is kind of a medium mechanistic thing. That it's an important mechanism.
I think one of the basic definitions of precautionary principle is a burden of proof mechanism, not that says that it's up to you to show me that you can do this without harming the resources, opposed to you can do it unless I can show you can't, but you are harming the resource.
Okay, well, no, if that's included generally in the common understanding of precautionary principle, then that's fine. I'm just saying it's a specific thing, though.
But maybe what we're talking about is either strengthening NEPA or using NEPA-type principles in other areas. Because when you think about, if you move from this concept of fisheries out beyond fisheries, I think we're looking to find out what's going on in our ocean waters in a lot of different areas with a lot of different resources. And so, the background of NEPA was NEPA doesn't say we have to do one option or another. It says we have to figure out what the effects are going to be. And I don't necessarily know. I mean, I know MMS, we have, a wealth of paper at least on impacts of the offshore oil and gas industry. But I'm not really positive that it's all that well informed. So maybe there's a standard that we should be applying even beyond fisheries, but trying to look at this a little more cumulatively than just an observer system on fisheries.
Yeah, we keep
See what I
going
mean?
back to fisheries and the Regional Management Council of Fisheries, and what's going on there really isn't transferable at all to the other kinds of resources and things we're talking about, because we're not going to tell the cruise ship industry, okay, we're going to make a regional council of cruise ship industry people and let them manage, or oil and gas people and let them manage. I mean, the fishermen are managing the fisheries, and that's, and it's sacrosanct. We're not going to be able to change it, but it doesn't provide much of a model for looking at these other resources.
I think if we can't change the fishing management councils, I'm not sure what we can do, frankly.
I mean, if that's, I might as well just
right
become a golf pro,
yeah.
Well, but this is an issue. The reason I can't be here tomorrow is that I'm going back to take a class in community-based ecosystem management around the coast. And there's this whole co-management thing, which is pretty popular now, that, the people who are involved in the community ought to take those management. Why isn't the council system exactly that? It's got public trust checks built in from the Department of Commerce. Everybody thinks it's this big evil thing where the fishermen are running the show. That's not the way I read the setup of the act. Now, maybe the congressional involvement makes it that, but I have a lot of trouble with people who criticize that part of the council system and still think that co-management ought to be a thing.
Let me go back to what Steve was asking, which is, I flipped ahead of these questions. What tool? We don't have the data that we need to do a lot of this, and so the first question is, what is the data we need to acquire, and what are the tools we need to acquire? Amber suggested that the non-fisheries models are even, we're talking right here about we don't know enough about the fisheries, and in Amber's presentation she said that the non-fisheries models are even more undeveloped. So would everybody agree we have a lot of tool and data development to pull off what we're proposing here today, or many have proposed?
I'll offer a comment, and then Susan and I need to leave.
Right.
There is a small model at play in the Gulf of Maine region, something called the Ocean Data Partnership, where Canadian and U.S. federal agencies, as well as state agencies, have come together and have agreed that one of the big issues is we can't share data. So it's not really going down the road of what additional data do we want to generate, but how can we more effectively use the data we currently have? And it goes to metadata standards and whatnot, figuring out in the new world of electronics, how can we do some innovative things? And so I would just suggest there's an interesting model there where we've gotten 18 different state, federal, and provincial agencies to sign on and are now developing some protocols to do a better job sharing data.
Before I lose you, would you have any problem, given that sort of data collection capability is coming into being, was there any problem designing a program today that sort of that evolves as those capabilities evolve? So you write something that says we are going to generally evolve to a system, an ecosystem-based system, but we're going to wait for the data and the tools to catch up to us.
I would say that the ocean observation system effort has it right. There's a national backbone upon which you drape regional needs. And those regional needs can be funded either by federal agencies or by the states who are working on those things. So I think the big issue is, what are those standard requirements, what are those standard data sets that we want to have nationally so we can tell national stories and then allow regions to add to that.
And the way you define those standard data sets is to know what you are trying to do in ecosystem management. I mean, that has to be defined first, because you don't want to set up a monitoring system, a data collection system, unless it's driven by certain objectives that you're trying to achieve. You don't want to collect data on everything all the time. You want to have indicators.
And Larry, do you want to comment what you think the indicators we are? I know we've talked about this in the past, but.
Well, I agree that there are two sorts of things that you need to do, and I think Andy tried to make this point before. If you're going to do ecosystem-based management in marine systems, you have to know what it is you're managing, which requires that you have the data layers and the ability to map where resources are. I mean, the ocean isn't homogeneous, even though it looks blue. Even on a lot of the maps today, the land was all detailed and the ocean was blue. In fact, it's more complex than that. The resources are in particular places. And you know, the bathymetry and the oceanography and a lot of that kind of stuff we're able to map at this point. We're able to map a lot of the positions of where organisms are and where they go. There's less mapping of human activities, but those things all need to be integrated so that we can begin to see where the hot spots of interactions are and where there are opportunities for reducing conflict. The other thing is taking a more mechanistic modeling approach rather than just creating maps of what we're currently doing, of the sort that Andy talked about. Again, scenario analyses, simulation modeling sorts of things that allow you to integrate the various actors in the system and at least use the model to frame, based on what you know, what's likely to happen. Models are wrong, but they're a way of helping think about the process and develop various scenarios. If you use models, then you have to commit to monitoring the results if you do manipulations based on modeling. Because the only way the National Weather Service makes predictions that we all care to depend on is they develop models and then they integrate data in real time into the models and tune the models. So what you see is those nice hurricane forecasts, where the hurricane's going to go, are very intricate models with high amount of data assimilation into those models, and they're able to forecast pretty well. The technology exists to do that in these systems. We simply haven't made the investment to do it.
And let's go back to, as a segue to this question, which is how adaptive can our institutions be? And this is the question we were talking about this morning. I mean, if we have imperfect data and we have models set up that we acknowledge don't account for everything, but we'll collect data as they come in, how adaptive can we build this? And again, the question that came up this morning, how passive or active should they be? How much should we be reaching out, trying to test our assumptions, or how much should we be just taking the data in and then evolving as the data comes in and we see impacts? And
I'll take the bait if nobody else wants.
Yep.
And I think it's silly for us to not be doing at least passive adaptive management. I mean, it's pretty clear that we need to increase our rate of learning about how these systems work and how we can manage our behavior with respect to these systems. And the less attention we pay to how they work and how they respond to our manipulations, the more mistakes we're going to make. I mean, it's as simple as that. So passive adaptive management's a no-brainer. I mean, if children learn this, you make a mistake, you touch the stove, it's hot, you say, oh, don't do that anymore, right? So you have to learn from making mistakes, but if you don't monitor whether your effort produced what you hoped it was going to do or not, you can't learn from that. I think active adaptive management has been an extremely tough sell because it's very difficult to go, and Susan made this point, a lot of our resources and a lot of our resource users are extremely stressed now. I mean, it's a time of scarcity, and then you pop in and you say, we'd like to do an experiment on you that might influence your income. I mean, that just doesn't fly. And so, there have been a number of active adaptive management experiments proposed. The Columbia River management system that they put up, everybody agreed to it. All the stakeholders were involved. They ran it 2 or 3 years, and the whole thing just fell apart because people began to get stressed over what was happening and whether it was serving their interests or not. And so, if we don't do passive adaptive management, I don't know how we learn.
And also not only how we learn, but how we demonstrate our successes and how we get some buy-in for doing more of what we're doing. Because if we don't know if we succeeded or failed, I mean, hoping that we succeeded, if we're not even measuring that, we're not able to say, hey, this worked, let's do some more of this, or, you know, or
So in the summer flounder last month, they decided that their population projections had been wildly over-optimistic and they weren't rebuilding the summer flounder as fast as they thought they were. What a surprise. And so the conclusion was, they came back and they said, speaking of Mace, they said, so you know what, we're going to have to slash the quota by 10 million from 33 to 23. And the fishermen and the ASMFC said, nope, not doing it. How's that for being accountable?
Well, that's the second bullet there, is if we have this.
So clearly, duh, we ought to measure what we're doing, yeah. But then if you find out it's not working, maybe you should take some action in response to that? Maybe? Just maybe.
I mean, I guess I'm having a problem with where this, you know, what we're trying to get at with this the conversation about adaptive management. In other words, is that going to be, are we talking about a new national standard? Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, National Standard 2 requires the use of best available scientific information. To me, that already incorporates the idea of adaptive management, right? They have to, you can sue them if they don't take into account new information, correct? Right, so the problem with it is that someone has to, whoever we put in charge of this, how do you monitor to see that they're actually doing that, right? What are we talking about putting in the law here? Is there going to be some, if you don't do it, something bad happens to you, or who's going to pay attention, right? That's the problem, is that these systems all require so much maintenance in terms of active public participation, and I can tell you, it's not going to happen. I mean, it might happen if we require them to come to Duke Law School and have their meeting right here in front of us, but I don't think it's going to happen. I've never seen it happen.
Well, let me argue the other side, though. I would argue that the system has actually been pretty adaptive. Because if you look at the number of amendments to the FCMA since it was passed, especially the 96 amendments, if you look at the way the council's responded to things, when the whole limited access question came up, with sort of Alaska leading the way, a lot of them picked that up. South Atlantic Council, the Gulf Council wanted to deal with snapper, but the Congress held them up for 5 years. When this whole thing about essential fish habitat came up, they didn't have the resources to do it, but they made a pretty good trying to figure out what that was all about. Even one of the bright spots in the administration's FCMA reauthorization is they appear to me, the first reading, to have picked up on this peer review thing, where you got to get more peer review from outside. I think they actually picked up on that in that bill. So I'm not sure how much more adaptiveness you can require, actually.
That was my point. I don't know that it's something you can require that's not already required under the law.
But how do you enforce it? Is that what you
My question is, yeah, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of a legal, a line in a statute here, other than a national standard that says council shall, or the regional ocean council shall be, take new information into account. I don't know where that really changes.
Standard 2 is, you were cited before, it's use the best scientific information available. I think it's entirely different line in the statute to say revisit, collect the data and then revisit after 2-3 years of collecting data whether you have measurable success.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you declare a new management objective and you implement it and you don't monitor, then you can't be, no one can accuse you of doing badly because no one knows. So that could be an incentive not to monitor, because Steve can't sue you if you don't know what happened to the system after that, right? So it seems like some requirement to show whether it's back to performance standards. Is this doing what we set out to do or not? If you don't monitor, that can never be evaluated. And Steve pointed out that in the new Magnuson reauthorization bill, we're just going to stop monitoring bycatch. Well, bycatch becomes a non-problem if no one counts it anymore. The Spanish solved bycatch in the longline fishery by just keeping everything and calling it catch. Right?
But I mean, yeah, we don't have to beat it dead horse. I think they already do. I mean, fish. I have to apologize to Donna because I know I'm just talking about fish. That's the only thing I know about. So, I mean, I don't follow as much. I mean, it's interesting actually, because I complain a lot about the industry dominating the fisheries, but they really haven't dominated on the oil and gas side, right? They've actually gotten the other end of the stick on the oil and gas side for the most part. So it's interesting how that's played out. So, but in the fisheries context, they already do this. I mean, every year they sit down and they say, are we on our rebuild, if it's an overfished fishery, are we on track? And they have to say yes to NIMS. We're on target to rebuild this stock within when we said we would rebuild it. And if they're not, they have to correct and adjust and lower or adjust the quota. They already do all that. That's not the problem. The problem is that they set their rebuilding target at half of what it should be, because the science tells them it's somewhere between here and there.
Is that what happened this summer flounder, or did they come back and say, we're not on target, but we're not changing? Which was it?
The summer flounder, they said, it turns out they were wrong. They had thought that the quotas they were setting were getting them to the rebuild target faster than in fact they were.
So so there you actually came back, you visited, are we meeting our targets? No.
Right.
But then there was no legal means to get them to do it,
Well, not yet.
other than Steve suing them.
Right. I mean, they tried different things in that situation.
Right.
Red Snapper, which Steve also works on, what they did is they come back every so often and they say, well, we've realized now that we can't rebuild the stock by 2011, let's go for 2037. And they're allowed to do that under the current language of the Act. So that's the kind of, it's sort of the opposite of adaptive management. It's adaptive goals.
Well, Steve, if you were amending the Act, Steve, trying to avoid this problem, I mean, I think the danger here is punishing somebody for a good faith mistake. Now, let's not talk about whether this is good faith or not, but let's assume there were good faith mistakes. Because as Larry points out, the data's not very good, the models aren't very good. We're trying hard, but there's not a lot of resources to go to. So somebody makes an estimate and they say, we think we're really going to hit the target if we have X quota. Turns out they don't, and they would have to reduce the quota drastically to do it. But it was what we might call, for the minute, a good faith mistake. What's the punishment? I mean, what's the appropriate punishment, and how do you write that into law?
It's a good question.
Oh, I thought you had an answer.
Well, Section 304E of the Act right now talks about rebuilding as quickly as possible, right? And, we just had a big case in New England fighting over what that meant, whether it allowed them to continue overfishing for a few years, even when the stock was depleted, or whether they had to really bring it to a halt just immediately, and the court decided to give them a few years. The court built some slack into the system. We think it was a mistake in the case of the Cub, because we think they're actually going to crash both Gulf of Maine and Bridges Bank Cub. That's the way the law is set up right now. It does give them some slack in the system under the current status.
And are there ways that you think you could reasonably change the law?
We have, both NRDC and the Marine Fish Conservation Network have put letters in explaining how they would tighten down the language of the Act to give people really not more than the usual regulatory 18 months to really stop the overfish, to stop it. Yeah. Yeah, we can do it.
If I can interject here, I think that, again, we're getting into fisheries where there actually are fishery-dependent data, and you can say something. If we're talking about ecosystem-based management of all the various functions and human uses, the fishermen aren't going to go out and get us the data. And so we do have to talk about what sort of data, what kinds of things one would monitor to assess, like, on Andy's list, where ecosystem health, productivity, resilience. I mean, where the resilience meter is in the ocean, we got to talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And who's going to go read that meter?
Yeah, no kidding. In an objective way. Yes, Eric?
Yeah.
What about taking the ecosystem stuff that's in Magnuson's and strengthening it, like essential fish habitat, and giving there some accountability for different federal agencies to take on that ecosystem-based approach that's already built in, saying that if you're doing a project that affects essential fish habitat, you need to alter or not do that project. And right now, the way it's written, NIMS consults, the agency says we take your consultation into mind and into account, and they move on. And if how they move on and how they proceed doesn't do anything to protect that habitat, we're moving away from an ecosystem-based management goal that's already written into a statute. So how would you address that or change that?
Well, that's actually an excellent point. The whole EFH point is really interesting. Mike mentioned that the councils made a good faith effort at EFH. Some people felt like all they did was they said everything was EFH from the top of the mountains to the, easy, and therefore by making everything EFH, you make nothing EFH, and thus was born the HAPC concept, the Habitat Area of Particular Concern, where we actually really did look at hotspots in the ocean, which is not really all that bad an idea. But of course, what's happening, even with, and then at the end of the day, as you explained, in the Act, it's a toothless requirement, because all there is consultation right now. And the action agency, let's just say hypothetically, the Corps of Engineers, who's getting ready to grant a permit that's going to ruin 40 acres of the best swampland in Rhode Island or whatever it is, they can say, thank you so much for your concern about EFH. We're doing it anyway. And that's basically the end of it, basically. But even with that toothless requirement in the Act, the home builders and other people who want to build in places like Philosophy, they've had a holy war ever since CFH came in '96, trying to get rid of even the toothless requirements in the Act. So, far from increasing the teeth, they're getting ready to take all the teeth out of it. I mean, that's all the pressure's in the opposite direction right now in the EFH provisions of the Act, just as a practical matter. Yes, you could use provisions you have now, and you could bulk them up, but we're in danger of losing them entirely at this point.
But isn't that, I mean, if we're arguing for ecosystem-based management, and that is ways of maintaining or having ecosystem-based management?
That's totally a window into it. That's a great avenue into it, but we're in danger of losing that avenue completely.
Well, I just wonder where the support would be for ecosystem-based management if it's already being rejected so strongly.
Yeah, where indeed.
Well, let me say that we're talking about the federal level. That we have an interesting experiment in North Carolina right now with the Fisheries Reform Act and CHIP process, the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, which requires, it was part of our Fisheries Reform Act, I know many of you in the room know about this, it requires the three commissions, Marine Fisheries, Environmental Management, Water Quality, Coastal Management, Development, to agree on a coastal habitat protection plan to protect fisheries habitat with a very broad definition. And it requires them to develop this plan, and for all three commissions, they've now signed it, and it requires their subsequent regulations to act in accordance with that plan. It's a great experiment to see if we can make a difference with that. So, I mean, a lot of this discussion I think we need to have, and this was Kristen's point in part in her presentation, let's not just talk about the federal level here, and the federal Congress and the federal laws. Let's look at what the states are doing, because that's, especially on habitat and ecosystem stuff, that's where a lot of this is going to happen. And we haven't really had very much conversation about that today.
And in fact, Kristen laid out, the legal underpinnings for the states to do great things is, of course, one of them is the public trust doctrine. I mean, you could use the public trust doctrine as a great platform for making the states do a lot of things. Some of us like to get the public trust doctrine extended out to 200 miles. Actually, that's a whole different conversation. Anyway.
Yes, it is. Is there a federal public trust doctrine?
Yeah.
On the EFH point, I think one of the many problems with the EFH, I mean, the definition was way too broad, and there was no resources really to implement it effectively, and then, of course, the HAPCs came about. But I think one of the other problems was that you had not only were the home builders on one side, or the sort of the land-based activities, they were against EFH, but the way EFH came about, the fishing community was also against it, because NIMS really only had the authority to enforce EFH provisions against the fishing community. They can comment on the other activities, but all of a sudden you've put NIMS between very powerful land-based industries and a fairly powerful sea-based industry, and I really think there was no winning on EFH. So.
I mean, Mike's example sort of bear out the point. You can't do this as a top-down measure, but if you embrace sort of the regional approach and embrace a stakeholder approach where all those stakeholders involved in the development of it, you have a much better chance of bringing the whole, you're getting buy-in from the whole suite of stakeholders to an ecosystem plan than if you just dictate it from the top down.
And you also want to think about the backsliding approach, like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Put that in your whatever kind of act you're going to do, your NOPA, ORCA Act. Mm-hmm. Make sure the states can do lots better, but they can do no worse than whatever standards you put up in the National Act.
And Mike, in the CHIP Act, that was a mandate from the legislature to these state agencies, right? So the state agencies had to all act accordingly.
These are independent rulemaking commissions, so it was a mandate for both the agencies and the independent commission. Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Underwood can probably comment on how well CHIPS is working. You want to comment?
I'm sorry, what's CHIPS?
It's the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. It's part of what Mike talked about, the Fisheries Reform Act that was passed. And there's nothing like once you come up with this plan. But one, I heard an analogy of Noah's Ark and how that got built, and you take a farmer and say, well, go build the ark, and it's like, well, how do I do that? I have to do it 4 or 5 times before I really can kind of, you know, really make this thing happen. This thing took 6 or 7 years, and what was this thing going to look like? And basically, the final consensus was that it was going to be a heavily scientific document. It's 600 pages, because the whole thought was you got to describe these habitats. You've got to talk about what state they're in, so what affects them, what impacts them. So we took the approach of showing, you know, having a thick scientific document, and then whatever policy or anything that came out of that was all based in some sort of science, and it was a culmination of a tremendous amount of work from, you know, lots of publications from academics and so forth. And what makes that nice too is you can go back to the legislature and say, okay, we did what you asked us to do. Now you know, let's implement it. And the way we need to implement this, we need some other resources to do this. So you can kind of keep going back to that. And there was a lot of, one of the things that I think is interesting about the chip too is that people question, why is this going to be different than anything else? Because people had been on millions of blue ribbon panels and the coastal agenda with Hunts and all this other stuff when he was governor. And so why was this going to be different? Why should this? And the whole point was some of the language that talked about institutional change. I mean, there was legislation that said you will coordinate all 3 commissions and you're going to implement this thing. And if one of the 3 commissions passes something that's contrary to implementing this chip, then that other commission can get caught on the carpet, so to speak, for that. So there are some little pieces in here I think that's huge to really allow this thing to really work. And I can at least say in the short term that everyone, just the process of putting it together has really reinforced the commitment from these different divisions. And there's just a tremendous, it was a great experience, but it was a tremendous push and pull too of, you know, is this all going to be about regulations, or is this going to be a combination of just the process of how government interworks? At the same time, we probably do need some regulations, but then other people are saying, well, you know, that you've got your rules, you've just never enforced them. So why don't you get some more enforcement out there? Let's just give this thing that you've got out there a real chance to play out instead of, you know, coming up with new rules. I just wanted to say one other thing too about adaptive management, and it gets back to something that Dr. Orbach said. To me, adaptive management has had sort of a negative piece. In other words, I don't want to say that I've invested all this money and it didn't work. I mean, that's bad, because then you've got a lot of people coming in and going, what do you mean you wasted all our money? But sometimes you've got to go down the wrong road to figure out that that was the wrong road. But the way that you help to keep from going down that wrong road, I think, is to get other people involved in the review process. These outside, so the accountability of how you got there, it's better. And it's not such a bad thing to go, I made a mistake. That shouldn't be a bad thing. You know, it should be a good thing to admit that, to move on. But I think our accountability sometimes of how decisions are made, you got to have the political will, or the political, you know, nature of things really affects why you went down a particular way, and that's not what the science said. And so there's a lot of ways to get off track, but if you have some other outside peer review and everyone kind of understands what everybody's mission is, so I think you can come out with a better thing. And so your adaptive systems are easy to adapt. It's not such a bad thing if you make a mistake.
Can I follow up with one point?
Sure.
The other thing I think is really interesting to know is that the Fisheries Reform Act passed in 1997, 5 years after the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Program stewardship plan came on the street. And I firmly believe that the set of forces that enabled the Fisheries Reform Act to include something like the chip process would not have been there had the NEP not set up the context of the discussion among all the different parties. So when I'm talking about decadal strategies, That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I would firmly believe that if we had an NEP-like program that was headwaters to EEZ, that you would expect downstream from that more productive things that might be incentive, but they might be regulatory as well, that would follow on from that.
Well, we're almost at the end here. I wanted to try and take off another few questions here. Actually, before I do, let me just go back to this for a second. It seems to me that the political accountability point that you're making is, it's not just that we have to make people politically accountable for the updating of the system. We actually have to make the suite of stakeholders somehow responsible for the decision, so that the people who you would be fearful of being attacked by for making the wrong decision are actually just as much a party and own the decision as you do yourself. And that may come out of the building collaborative processes over time. You build that relationship, and then they're willing to work on that. The question, the bullet up here, I'm trying to decide as I stand here whether we really cover it or not. But you know, talking to Laura Cantral at lunch, talking to people involved in the debate in Washington, as this program might be implemented around the country, you know, there is a great resistance to increased judicial review. You've scared the pants off some of the stakeholders, Steve, and they don't want you to have any more hooks. However, you know, we definitely seem to have a need of accountability and enforceability for some of these. You know, as Andy was saying, we need to have some accountability for what we're aspiring to implement. So, if you're in that vein, what are the things that we must have accountability for? What sorts of things can we not let be done voluntarily, or we'll never get success? Is it these national standards with so much more detail that we're doing that have to be? Is it the adaptive system? Is it the regional councils have to have some requirement to meet? Or should we just put it all into a voluntary framework? And that's not a question that's really getting much response. So we're going to move on. Yeah, we are in the brain dead hour, and we have food and drink there soon. Well, yes, Jeff.
I just want to. The only two ways I can think of to limit judicial review are by making the standards vague, or by actually having Congress can say you can't sue,
right?
Remove jurisdiction from the court. So I don't think we want either one of those things, right? Vague standards or.
I think there are some in Congress who would like to do the latter, though.
Okay. Oh well.
So then there's a question of, well, you may want to say there's no worthwhile compromise to make on that.
I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, I have not heard. I mean, that you see it once in a while on a rider where you have the stripping, the jurisdiction stripping, but you don't. I don't mean stripping, but jurisdiction stripping. But you don't. I've never seen it as sort of a fundamental part of an environmental law. That would be a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And the sort of the culture of how our environmental laws have evolved has been based on this idea of the public having access to the courts to hold the federal government accountable. And I'm sure you're right. There are people who would want to strip that out. That's a scary prospect to me, because I think that there's a book out there. It's written by a professor at my law school called "Why Lawsuits Are Good for America." And, we need the Steves in the group. We also need the NEPs who are going to, do this more consensus building. But, that's actually something I would fight very strongly to keep in, is some access to the court system. I mean, it's you've got those three branches there for a reason, so.
Yeah, I think the Coastal Zone Management Act gives us another model of accountability that might be, that we could use. So the plans have to be to meet the guidelines in the Coastal Zone Management Act in order to get this extra benefit, the consistency requirement. So if there's some benefit that the whatever the umbrella is there that's enforcing these national policies or national standards can withhold until those standards are met, that would be another kind of accountability.
You know, an interesting sort of tidbit, I guess, is, you know, the state of Mississippi prior to, I mean, years ago, prior to ever Katrina ever hitting, with their casinos. I don't know if anybody's ever been down there, but lots of casinos on the water.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah, so-called floating casinos, but on barges, basically, changed the face of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And some people say for the better. I mean, it's poorest state in the country, literacy rate is the lowest in the country, et cetera. But the interesting thing about it was 8 years after the casinos hit, and they hit quickly, lots of development followed very quickly. And Biloxi and Gulfport were just not set up, and Ocean Springs for that matter, just not set up to handle it all. Wetlands filling like crazy, you know, flooding happened within a couple of years. So there was very much a lot of problems going on. And NOAA came in and said, we're going to take your funding away and your ability to challenge consistency, et cetera. And because they had not updated their coastal program, nowhere in the coastal program does the word casino appear in Mississippi. And they've been there since '92. So, and there was an honest debate going on in that state agency about how worthwhile it would be. Are we really getting that much money from the federal government? And we don't really challenge consistency that often. So, I mean, it is interesting, but I think that it forced a debate within Mississippi. Now, no one never put the hammer down and said, we're taking your consistency away, and we're taking your funding away. And now, I think it's a different conversation after Katrina and the need to rebuild and the role of the federal government there. But it's...
Approved a law that allows casinos on land.
Yep.
Oh, absolutely. 5 days later... But it doesn't really change the development, though, because you have this burgeoning industry there that the coastal program has not planned for. And so that's still an issue. But yes, casinos will not be on land if you're ever there.
All right, I'm going to call us to close. I'm going to ask if anybody has any concluding statements at this point in time. I think we've all litigated this pretty well. But, and I thank all the panelists once again and the moderators for and most of all Ingrid and Marc and Sarah for putting on a wonderful conference. Thank you.